It started before 78. Sands, we adopted the name Sands in 1978, but prior to that, it was the SPDA, Stillbirth and Perinatal Death Association. It all started after I had a stillbirth in 1975. I worked in psychiatry as a psychiatric social worker, and I worked in a therapeutic community where staff were very supportive of each other. Hospital where I had my stillbirth was one where my husband was a consultant, and I was well known to the maternity unit staff. What astounded me at the time was how no one would speak to me. I was put in after the stillbirth. Of course, in those days you weren't allowed to see your baby. Your partner wasn't brought into the room with you, so you laboured on your own. And as you gave birth, nurses leaned over you and there was a sideway pass of the baby, and by the time they straightened up, the baby was out of the room. You never saw the baby. There were no pictures taken. Your husband was told about how to register the death and that the burial would be taken care of by the hospital. He was also advised not to discuss the dead baby with you because it would upset you. No one thought about how he would be upset. And so I went home and had this terrible empty arms feeling that is very common after stillbirth. And about 6 weeks later, Belle Mooney, a journalist, published an article in the Guardian. She'd had a baby at about the same, dead baby at about the same time. And she described the same kind of feelings and reactions that I was receiving. And what that did for me was it normalized my reactions. So I wrote to the Guardian and said, me also too, and if you publish this letter, perhaps if people contact me, we can get something together to offer guidance to hospitals about how to care for us. There was a deluge of letters, so I wrote to all the other nationals. One of them sent me a letter saying they suggested I went to speak to my vicar, never mind that I'm not Christian. But on the whole, they were published, and I was getting 100 letters a day from bereaved parents, some bereaved 40 years earlier, some recently bereaved. And I put everything that was mentioned more than once into a questionnaire with a view to getting responses that would help us teach professionals how to help parents who are bereaved. I then did what a lot of parents do and dived into another pregnancy, which was unstable, so I spent almost the entire pregnancy in hospital. And throughout this time, letters were coming in from people, and I was sending responses, and my husband would bring my daughter to visit me, pick up letters I'd written, post them through his hospital. And then after the birth of my son, I met Judy Liston, who came to help me collate what had come in and make sense of it. And then shortly after that, Catherine Gregg contacted me, and the three of us used to meet once a week. By then, my address and phone number was in every library in the country, and we were the Stillbirth and Perinatal Death Association. In 1978, we had a meeting. There were several hundred people in contact, and we called a meeting in Faye's flat. Faye lived in Belsize Park in London, had a lovely big flat, and that's when we became SANS, and we formed a committee. One of the major problems, as always with charities, is finance. We weren't a charity. The charity commissioners refused to register us as a charity. We had three aims. One was to educate professionals, one was to support research to prevent future stillbirths, and the sticking point with them, our third and main aim, was to offer support to newly bereaved parents. The Charity Commissioners said that wasn't a charitable aim, and that if we said all bereaved parents were mentally ill and needed support, they would register us, and I wasn't prepared to do that. So I was happy at that 1978 meeting to delegate negotiations with the Charity Commissioners to Sue Burgess, who was the lead person in Wales at that time. There was, at about the same time as all this was going on, I was contacted by a paediatrician, David Morris, and by the perinatal bereavement unit at the Tavistock Clinic, to which I was invited to join. And between us, we set up the Stillbirth Working Party, which consisted of a couple of psychiatrists, 2 paediatricians, and representatives of the major bereavement bodies in the country. I didn't want to found a charity. I just thought, I don't know how to do this, and it's too big. Its cruise was for widows and widowers. There was, 2 others. There were the cot death people. Lady Limerick was one, and they wouldn't have us as part of their charity because they said we'd swamp them and change the focus. And then there was the charity that supports people who've had a child die, and they didn't want us either because they said that someone who'd lost a son aged 33 wouldn't understand the reaction of someone who'd lost a child they'd never met. So that's what pushed us into founding the charity. The main focus of this working party was to draw up a leaflet to help bereaved parents to be given to them when they had a dead baby in hospital. And the brilliant stroke someone had was to put the leaflets in a kind of holder, and on the front of the holder was advice for staff as to what they should do and how they could improve the service. But that took its time coming out. It was published in 1981, and within a year, practice had improved in almost every hospital in the country. Reactions of others to people who'd had dead babies. I remember phoning my oldest friend in this country while I was still in hospital for comfort, and what I got was, well, at least you've got one. Some of us can't have any. I worked in a psychiatric therapeutic community, and I was helping a friend out in Camden Lock, as it was then, antique stall. And one of the psychoanalysts from the therapeutic community came to buy something, looked up, saw it was me, stuttered, turned and walked out. So my own support network in terms of work disappeared at the same time. It hurt. Not them, but all of it hurt, the fact that I was isolated and people didn't offer support. Well, things just moved apace. I was back at work. I worked part-time from the birth of my daughter in 1969, so I had time at home to meet with Judy and Catherine. We had written leaflet, but the committee that we'd set up in 1978, we met at least once a year, but we communicated well, and we'd drawn up quite a few leaflets for parents, because what would happen is someone would start a local group, and I would go and offer a training session on how to support bereaved parents, and we drew up leaflets on various topics to help them. At that stage, there was a lot of skepticism from people about the value of making memories of dead babies. So I remember going to speak to a group of doctors in a postgraduate unit in a hospital, and this doctor said, "You can't take a photograph of a stillborn baby, it'll come out blurred." I mean, it just showed the kind of fear of death that was around. Death at birth is not right. We changed the death certificate to allow a first name for the baby. When I had my baby, you weren't allowed to give your baby a first name. We suddenly, out of the blue, received the Queen's Award for Industry. £50 it was, not much, but we didn't even know they were noticing us. And that was quite a boost when you were struggling. I'd moved the place I worked, and it was much easier to slip the post through the hospital system in the new place. The major change came about with the publication of the leaflet for bereaved parents by the Department of Health. But before that, we'd been involved in a couple of films. A friend of mine phoned me and said, there was a program at 6 o'clock or after the news. They're making something on stillbirths. Have they contacted you? So I said no and contacted them, and they said, oh, we hoped someone would contact us because we need to know what to focus on and who to contact, which I thought was quite a naive approach. And then I think it was 1983, Kenneth Clarke, who was the Minister of Health, gave us funding under Section 64, which was the first time we'd ever received any external funding. One of the problems when you've got no central organisation like the one you have now with people who've got time is raising funds, getting people to do charitable runs and things like that. I didn't have time, I didn't know how to set about it, and I didn't want to. That wasn't what I aimed. I aimed at improving services and not spending my time raising funds. Esther Ranson made a film about stillbirths and trundled me up to Ipswich to show someone a picture of a deformed baby, an encephalic baby. She'd had it, hadn't seen the baby, and was having nightmares. And when Esther put out publicity that she was going to be making a film, this woman contacted her, and so she sent me off with a picture to show it to her. And that was really very useful. One of the things I wish I'd done differently was to work out how to hand over the reins. I did that really badly. I thought the people who took over from me were far more efficient than I had been. I think Catherine Gregg summed it up beautifully. She said, I wish they didn't make me feel that the next baby is a sticking plaster over the dead baby. You need time to mourn, and your partner needs time to mourn. And hospitals have to have systems to support staff who are there delivering the babies, because they need time to recover from the trauma of it. It's traumatic for them, but they still have to continue and be professional. But it's the people said, oh, well, she's had another baby, so it's all okay. And that attitude is still prevalent. Sans as it is now blows my mind. I could never have conceived that this phone calls that used to come into my house, and they were always after 6 p.m. because in those days it was cheaper to phone after 6 p.m. And they would invariably start when we were sitting eating, and my husband and 2 children would just growl at me and get up and walk away with their plates to somewhere where they didn't have to listen. But that's what happens when you start something with no money. But I could never have conceived that that would turn into this high-functioning organization, which is very effective. Anyone I speak to has heard of it. Learn more about how organizations work. Because I didn't start out to fund a charity, it's difficult to answer that, because I set out to help people, not start a charity, fundraise, educate. Yes, that was part of my plan, but it's difficult to answer that. It's changed amazingly. For a start, you're allowed to have your partner or people of your choice present while you're in labour, if it's a stillbirth. You're allowed to see, hold your baby. Sandra's got the memory kit, which is given to bereaved parents. I don't know that staff are getting enough support. I don't know if partners of the mother are getting enough support, because that's a major problem as well. I remember one of the people who contacted me wrote and said, we split up now. I think it happened because about 3 or 4 weeks after our stillbirth, I was at a party and I laughed at something someone said, and my husband said if I could laugh when we should have been mourning, he couldn't live with me. And obviously what people hadn't recognized in that setup was how deeply the husband had been affected by the stillbirth, and no one was offering him anything. He was told to offer his wife something. So there's a lot to be done. I'm also anxious about existing children and the subsequent children. The sticking plaster is a good description in terms of what's expected. But existing children may well think that they caused the death of the baby. They sneezed, they did something that made mummy angry. She went rushed into hospital, baby died. If they hadn't sneezed or they hadn't made mummy angry, maybe the baby would be okay. And subsequent children, I remember receiving something from a woman who said, I had a little girl and she was perfect, but she was born dead. I then had a little boy a year later, and from the beginning he's been difficult. And then I had another little girl and she's perfect. I would hate to be that little boy. He's an adult now, of course, because he was wrong. He should have been a girl, and there's nothing he can ever do to make himself all right for his mother. So I think focusing on existing and subsequent children is important. couple of my friends' daughters have trained as midwives, and they have teaching on this, and they're also offered guidance on how to speak to parents and offer advice, and I thought that was an immense improvement, and all of them have heard of sounds. It's really interesting. I go to a writing group where we're writing memoirs for our grandchildren, and one of the women there said that in 1965 she gave birth to a premature baby which was whipped from the hospital she gave birth into an intensive care unit, died 2 days later. She saw him when he was delivered, but off where he went. Husband was told about the same thing. We'll arrange burial, you register the birth and death, don't talk to her about it because it'll upset her. 67 she had a girl, and 69 she had a girl. Her husband died last year. He'd never told her anything about where the baby was, even though she pleaded, where the baby was buried. And it was last year that she went and found the baby's grave. It's 1965 to 2007. Unresolved loss because of inadequate support at the time. There were some positive memories. There were people who just came up and hugged me, even if they didn't say a word, which was fine. You don't have to say something. A hug or a clasp of the hand is good. The comradeship that we developed when we were starting SANS was good. And it makes you angsty about grandchildren because it's difficult to trust the world not to throw a wobbly at one of your children. My fantasy about how things are now is that no parent goes unsupported when they have a baby, and that they're given at least some information about SANS, and that they helped to make memories. When you mourn, you have to go through what you have. If you have no memories to go through, it's very difficult to resolve your mourning. Oh, that's very difficult. Maintain the momentum of support and education, and hopefully pressure. There's research showing how to decrease the number of stillbirths. Pressure the health service in this country to actually implement the research. Expectant parents have a lot of anxieties and worries, and most of them know nowadays that it's possible to have a dead baby or a baby that's not perfect, and that is sometimes clashing with their desires to have as natural a birth as possible. Judy, who was one of the founder people with me, had a home birth, which she wanted. Her first child had been born by a home birth, and her stillbirth was a home birth, and she didn't have regrets about that, the fact it was a home birth rather than a hospital birth. But I think more education of the public than individuals, so it's in public awareness. And I don't know about birth classes, whether it should be brought up there. Some people will be terrified, and some people would say, yeah, of course. But if everyone is educated more generally, then the awareness is there before the pregnancy. I don't know if I can do 40 words, but I would take 2. No longer. No longer do you labour alone. No longer do you mourn a phantom baby because you weren't allowed to see or hold your baby or make any memories. No longer, well, I hope no longer, are people holding out the next baby as a bit of sticking plaster to put over the dead baby. Just the words no longer. No longer is there no space for the dead baby's name.